How a few tiny cities birthed the world's greatest minds. There was a time, long before our age of sprawling empires and global networks, when a handful of small rival cities, scattered across a rugged coastline, produced more brilliant minds per person than any other period in human history. This wasn't a fluke. It was an explosion, an intellectual supernova. In just a few centuries, these tiny communities gave us the foundations of modern philosophy, the blueprint for democracy, the discipline of history, the masterpieces of drama, and the very language we use for science and math. Thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, names that still echo in universities today, all walked the streets of a single city. Playwrights who literally invented tragedy and comedy competed for prizes in open-air festivals. Historians started looking at the past not as myth, but as a chain of cause and effect that you could actually investigate. And in the public square, for the first time ever, the idea that the people should govern themselves took root and blossomed. So what was it about these specific places? What was in the water in ancient Greece that allowed so many world-changing ideas to grow? And maybe the biggest question of all, could it ever happen again? This is the story of how a perfect storm of geography, rivalry, wealth, and a radical new way of running a society created the conditions for genius. It's a story that shows that genius isn't just born, it's made. And the formula that created it holds some profound lessons for us today. The Greek world, a land of fragments. To get what happened, you first have to picture the stage. And that stage, ancient Greece, was completely different from the other great civilizations of the ancient world. If you look at a map of Egypt, you see the Nile River, a single artery feeding a vast centralized kingdom. Look at Persia, and you see huge open plains, perfect for building a massive unified empire under one ruler. Now look at Greece. It's a mess of fragments. It's a chaotic splash of mountains, peninsulas, and islands that shatters the landscape into 1,000 little pockets. The terrain is rugged, unforgiving, and makes just getting to the next town over incredibly difficult. More than 80% of the land is mountains, so communities were walled off from each other by nature. The sea wasn't a barrier, it was a highway, but it connected hundreds of individual islands and coastal towns, each with its own harbor and its own identity. This unique geography basically wrote the script for Greek politics. It didn't lead to a single unified kingdom. Instead, it gave birth to something else entirely, the polis. We translate it as city-state, but that phrase doesn't really do it justice. A polis was the core of your identity. It was a community of citizens with their own laws, their own customs, their own patron god, and a fierce, almost fanatical sense of independence. You didn't think of yourself as Greek the way someone from Egypt thought of themselves as Egyptian. You were an Athenian, a Spartan, a Corinthian, a Theban. These weren't just provinces, they were essentially tiny, independent countries, each with its own government, its own army, and its own culture. And we're talking about an incredibly small scale here. Athens, during its golden age, was one of the biggest and most powerful, and it only had an area of about 1,000 square miles and maybe 40 to 50,000 adult male citizens. Many city-states were way smaller than that. Now, you might look at all this fragmentation and think it's a huge weakness, a recipe for constant fighting. And yeah, there was plenty of that. But to understand the birth of genius, you have to see this fragmentation for what it was, a giant laboratory for civilization. Instead of one single culture dictated by a pharaoh, Greece was a dynamic ecosystem of over 1,000 independent city-states, each one a separate experiment in how to run a society. You had monarchies, oligarchies run by the rich military states, and radical democracies all existing at the same time. This diversity created a marketplace of ideas. Which government is most stable? Which trade policies make you rich? Which military tactics work best? These weren't just theories, They were being tested in real time by hundreds of competing states. This landscape of fragmentation wasn't a bug, it was the feature. It meant that no single bad idea, no single tyrant could crush the intellectual spirit of the whole region. If a thinker got exiled from one city, they could just move to another and find a new audience. This decentralized, experimental world was the fertile ground where new ideas could finally grow. The engine of genius, competition, agon. So if the geography was the soil, what was the engine that churned it? It all comes down to one Greek word, agon. Agon means contest or rivalry, but for the Greeks it was way more than that. It was part of their cultural DNA. They believed competition was what revealed excellence, what pushed people and cities to be their absolute best. And in Greece, everything was a competition. This wasn't just about war, though it was definitely about war. The constant rivalry between cities like Athens, Sparta and Thebes was a brutal, high-stakes game. Sparta, basically a giant military camp, perfected the hoplite phalanx and bred the most feared soldiers of the age. Athens couldn't match that on land, so it poured its money and creativity into building the most powerful navy the world had ever seen, completely changing naval warfare. This military argon forced constant innovation. The brief moment they all teamed up against Persia showed what they could do together, but as soon as that threat was gone, it was right back to competing with each other. But the Greek agon was fought just as fiercely in the marketplace and on the festival stage. Economically, cities battled for control of trade routes. Corinth, sitting on a perfect strip of land, got fabulously wealthy by controlling the flow of goods between two seas. This commercial competition pushed the Greeks to become master sailors and merchants, setting up colonies from France to the Black Sea. And this wasn't just about grabbing resources, it was a pipeline for new ideas. Contact with Egypt, Phoenicia and Persia brought a flood of new knowledge in math, astronomy and art back to Greece, giving them the raw materials for their own breakthroughs. But you really see this spirit of agon in their culture. The Olympic Games were religious festivals, sure, but they were also intense competitions where a victory brought incredible glory to your home city. Even art was a competition. In Athens, during the festival of Dionysia, playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides didn't just show their new plays, they competed against each other for a prize. Imagine if our best filmmakers or authors went head-to-head in a state-sponsored annual tournament. This environment created immense pressure to innovate, to push the boundaries of storytelling and character. This is the furnace that forged tragedy and comedy into high art in a ridiculously short amount of time. This relentless, all-encompassing competition created a powerful feedback loop. The need to win on the battlefield drove new technology. The need to win in the market drove exploration. And the need to win on the stage drove artistic excellence. In this world, standing still meant falling behind. Complacency meant you became irrelevant. Excellence wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was a survival strategy. This constant struggle, this agon, was the tireless engine that drove the Greeks to be great. The fuel for thought, the socio-economic miracle. Look, great ideas don't just appear out of thin air. A society can have all the competitive drive in the world, but if people are busy with the daily grind of survival, they don't have time for philosophy or science. The genius explosion in ancient Greece, especially in Athens, was fueled by a unique set of conditions that created something incredibly rare in history: a lot of people with the time to just think. It started with a big shift in the economy. The old world of landed aristocrats started to change as trade and colonization took off. The invention of coinage around the 7th century BCE transformed commerce, creating new kinds of wealth. A prosperous class of merchants, traders and artisans emerged, whose status came from their success, not their family name. This made society more dynamic and created a larger group of citizens with a real stake in the city's success. Athens especially hit an economic jackpot. Its nearby silver mines at Lorient were a massive source of cash. On top of that, as leader of the Delian League, an alliance meant to fight Persia, Athens basically turned the League into its own empire, demanding tribute and using the money to fund its ambitions. This wealth built its navy, its magnificent buildings like the Parthenon, and, critically, it was used to support the arts and sciences. But the real magic is how this money interacted with the social structure. And this brings us to a difficult, uncomfortable truth. The Greek miracle was built on the backs of slaves. In Athens, a huge portion of the population was enslaved. They did the brutal manual labor in the mines, on the farms, and in the homes. Even families that weren't particularly wealthy often owned a slave or two. The grim reality is that this system freed up a huge number of male citizens from constant, back-breaking work. This doesn't mean citizens were all just lounging around. Many were still farmers or craftsmen. But slavery created a baseline of leisure time for the citizen class that was unheard of in the ancient world. They had time to go to the assembly, serve on juries, see plays, and hang out in the public square, the agora, to talk about politics, news, and new ideas. And within this citizen class, wealth was spread out more evenly than in most other ancient societies. Of course, there were rich and poor, but it's estimated that in the 5th century BCE, a large majority of Athenian citizens owned their own land. The government even paid people for public service, like being on a jury, so poorer citizens could afford to participate in civic life. When you put all this together, it was completely transformative. You had a society getting rich from trade and tribute. You had a large class of citizens freed from the most exhausting labor by slavery. And you had wealth and political power spread widely enough that thousands of men felt like they had a personal stake in the city. This created a large, leisured, and highly motivated group of people. They had the time, the money, and the drive to do more than just survive. This surplus of time and energy was the essential fuel for Greece's intellectual engine. It's a fascinating and complicated picture, right? If you're enjoying digging into history like this, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We get into questions like this every week. And let me know in the comments, which Greek thinker is your favorite and why? The Crucible of Ideas, Athenian Democracy. So you've got the fuel, the prosperity and leisure time. But what focused it? What turned all that potential into a laser beam of genius? That was the radical political experiment of Athenian democracy. Democracy wasn't just how they voted. It was a way of life that completely changed how citizens thought and talked to each other. It created a world where the sharpest weapon you could have was your mind. At the heart of it all was the assembly, the ecclesia, where any adult male citizen could show up, speak his mind, and vote on everything, from declaring war to spending public money. Imagine it. Major policy decided not by a king, but in a mass meeting of thousands of citizens on a hillside. This system created an incredible culture of public debate. If you wanted to get anywhere in this world, being strong or from a fancy family wasn't enough. You had to be persuasive. You needed to master logic and rhetoric. You had to be able to break down a problem, come up with a plan, and sell it to a tough crowd. The Agora, the city's central marketplace, was a non-stop forum for this, where people didn't just trade goods, they traded and battled over ideas. This created a huge demand for a new kind of education. Teachers called the sophists became celebrities, traveling around and charging big money to teach young men the art of the argument. But this new focus on winning arguments also sparked a powerful backlash. Enter Socrates. Socrates was a total product of this democratic world. He spent his days in the agora, not lecturing, but asking questions. His famous Socratic method, just relentlessly asking questions to expose weak arguments, was a mirror of the city's own culture. He challenged the smug certainty of the sophists and forced his fellow Athenians to really think about what they believed. In the end, they saw him as a threat and executed him, but his entire life's work was only possible in a society that valued open debate. Socrates' student, Plato, built an entire philosophical system on his teacher's ideas and founded the Academy, the first real university in the West. And Plato's student, Aristotle, went on to categorize pretty much all of human knowledge, from logic to biology to politics. This entire philosophical lineage, the bedrock of Western thought, was born directly out of the intellectual demands of a democratic city like Athens, even as other important thinkers were emerging in places like Miletus and Syracuse. And if you want proof of how important this was, just look at Athens' great rival, Sparta. Sparta was a powerhouse, a society engineered for one thing, military domination. And they produced the best soldiers around. But they didn't produce philosophers or playwrights. The Spartan system was a rigid oligarchy that demanded conformity. There was no public debate, no agora buzzing with new ideas. The state controlled your life, and critical thinking wasn't just ignored, it was seen as dangerous. The stark difference between Athens and Sparta says it all. Both were Greek city-states. Both were caught up in the same competitive agon. But only one created the freedom needed for the mind to truly flourish. Athenian democracy, with all its flaws, its exclusion of women, slaves and foreigners, its moments of mob rule, created a unique space where speech was power, debate was a duty, and a good argument was the most valuable thing you could have. The legacy. Why it still matters so. What was the formula? How did these tiny cities change the world? When you look at the evidence, the Greek miracle stops being a miracle and starts looking like the logical result of a rare and powerful combination. First, you had the fragmented geography. It created a laboratory of over 1,000 different city-states, preventing any one culture from becoming stagnant and allowing for a huge diversity of thought. Then you had that spirit of intense competition, the argon. It pushed these cities to constantly get better, in war, in business, and in culture, because excellence was how you survived and earned respect. Underpinning it all was economic prosperity and leisure. This was built on trade, empire, and the morally fraught system of slavery. But it gave a critical number of citizens the time and energy to think about things beyond their next meal. And finally, you had the crucible of Athenian democracy. This political system made persuasive argument the key to power, creating a massive demand for intellectual skill. And the legacy of all this? It's basically the modern world. The questions first asked by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are still the questions we argue about in ethics and politics today. Democracy, born in Athens, is still the most powerful political idea on the planet. The very ideas of tragedy and comedy, the practice of history, the rules of geometry, and humanist art all trace their roots back to this brief, brilliant moment. Their ideas didn't just disappear. They were spread by the empire of Alexander the Great, who was Aristotle's student. They were copied by the Romans, who conquered Greece but were culturally conquered by it. They were saved and studied by Islamic scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba while Europe was in its dark ages, and then they were spectacularly rediscovered during the Renaissance, kicking off a new scientific and artistic revolution. Our world today is, in many ways, just a 2,500-year-long conversation with these ancient Greeks. Which brings us back to that last question. Could it happen again? Maybe it already has. You could point to Renaissance Florence, which looked a lot like a Greek polis with its rival merchant families and explosion of art. Or the coffee houses of Enlightenment London and Paris, where new ideas about science and liberty were hammered out. The Greek formula suggests that these golden ages aren't accidents. They need a competitive environment where ideas can clash, enough prosperity to free up minds, a culture that actually values and rewards creativity, and a social structure that empowers people and lets them speak freely. The story of these tiny cities is more than a history lesson. It's a reminder that the most valuable resource any society has isn't gold or oil, but the potential of its citizens. The Greeks weren't born smarter than anyone else. They just found a formula that allowed an extraordinary number of them to become as smart as they could possibly be. Conclusion: in the end, the spectacular rise of the Greek intellect wasn't some gift from the gods on Mount Olympus. It was a profoundly human achievement, the result of a rare mix of place, time, and ideas. It came from fragmented geography and fierce rivalry, from economic freedom and political experiments. These small, argumentative cities, in their constant fight for an edge, created the most fertile ground for human thought the world has ever known. What they prove is that genius isn't a solo act. It blossoms in communities that value curiosity, tolerate disagreement, and channel the power of competition toward creation, not just destruction. The story of these tiny cities is a timeless reminder that when we create environments that foster debate, reward ingenuity, and empower citizens, we don't just build better societies, we build a better world.